Welcome to the Religious Studies Project, hosted by David Robertson and myself, Christopher Cotter. This podcast is produced in association with the British Association for the Study of Religions, and you can visit our website at www.religiousstudiesproject.com.
Popular religious phenomena, from vegetables depicting the face of Christ or Arabic script of Koran verses, frequently attract derision and dismissal from religious officials in the media and scholars. But in dismissing such phenomena as trivial or amusing is underestimating the importance of the sacralization of everyday life and vernacular personal experience in the religious lives of real individuals. To discuss vernacular religion with us today, we're joined by Dr. Marion Bowman, who's the head of the Religious Studies Department at the Open University. She's also a former president of the BASR and a former president of the Folklore Society. So, first of all, Marion, welcome to the Religious Studies Project.
Thank you.
Perhaps we could start just by defining what we're talking about, vernacular religion. Would you differentiate from popular religion or spirituality? How does the term relate?
The reason I very much picked up on the term vernacular religion, particularly as it's explained by Leonard Primiano, is that it gets round some, though not all, some of the difficulties of terms like popular religion. So this is opposed to unpopular religion. There are problems with most terminology. There are problems with most terminology. What we're actually talking about in relation to the study of vernacular religion is religion as it's lived. Mm-hmm. That everyday religion. The part that belief, worldview plays in everyday life. So in the food you eat, in the way you see the world, possibly in how you dress, possibly who you associate or don't associate with, and so on, in the myriad little details of everyday life, the way that religion has an impact on that. So when we're talking about vernacular religion and stressing that it's religion as it's lived, this isn't necessarily a neat, well thought out set of beliefs that are well articulated and so on. It's how you do religion. It's what people do in relation to their worldview in everyday life. The reason people started using the term vernacular religion is very much related to the use of vernacular architecture in the study of architecture. The idea that buildings, architecture, turn out differently in different places because you use local materials. So you can construct a house, but whether that house is in rough stone or wood or whatever will be created by local conditions. Mm-hmm. And so things turn out differently because you use slightly different materials. So to some extent, using vernacular gives the idea of coming from where people are and also allowing for the fact that there is huge possible variety in the way that people do religion. So, for example, I remember the huge shock with which I first encountered some aspects of Hungarian Calvinism. Mm-hmm. I thought I knew about Scottish Calvinism, so to discover Hungarian Calvinism with beautiful costumes, with the churches decorated with greenery, and so on, you thought, wait a minute, this is Calvinism, but not as I know it from a Scottish context. So things that are notionally the same turn out differently in different contexts. And that's one aspect of what you're trying to get at by using the terminology of vernacular religion. Mm-hmm. So, for example, New Age in Newfoundland looks, feels, has different reference points than New Age in Britain or America or elsewhere. Or it's the difference between how what we might broadly call New Age might have turned out in Glastonbury as opposed to in a small village in the west of Scotland.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we'll talk about Glastonbury a little bit later on. I'd like you to maybe use it as a bit of a case study to describe what we're meaning, but let's unpick a little bit more of the sort of methodological, theoretical issues. One thing is to say, how is this related to folklore? Is folklore and vernacular religion the same thing? or are they very different things?
I think, first of all, we need to start unpicking some of what we mean by the term folklore, which might be helpful. I did an MA in folklore at Memorial University of Newfoundland, and folklore in that sense was folklore as understood as an academic subject, sometimes in North America referred to as folkloristics.
Okay.
And very much dealing with cultural tradition. So, for example, the department that used to be at Sheffield University was the Centre for English Cultural Tradition and Language. So talking about folklore in this broad sense, so it's not folklore as in that's just not true. Mm-hmm. But what the study of religion gains from the study of folklore is a very well-developed vocabulary of genres, of different ways of talking about stories, reminiscence, personal experience, narrative, of understanding that within any given culture there are lots and lots of different aspects to it which have cultural resonance and which come down to one as part of the cultural tradition. So this is folklore, if you like, in the sense of your mental furniture. Mm-hmm. You don't even think about it. You know, a seat's there, you sit on it. You don't think about it. But your expectations about what you think spiritual beings are, whether you think there are spiritual beings, how you would describe such beings, how you would expect them to act, what you need to do to keep them happy, just in case, all of that sort of thing comes into the realm of folklore, but it's much more than that, because what many folklorists would say is folklore isn't just about finding a group of illiterate peasants, ideally who have never seen any form of media, ideally who live so rurally that they haven't been contaminated by the contemporary world. It's not that at all. The idea of who are the folk? Well, we are. Uh-huh. But folklore tends to operate in groups. So where there's a commonality between people, you tend to generate folklore in terms of certain beliefs, way of doing things, stories about, and so on and so forth. So it's folklore in that very broad sense. Mm-hmm. The trick with folklore is, using this folkloristics, this very broad sense of folklore, the reason that folklore in this sense, and cultural tradition and ideas about this, might help religious studies is that it's very much based in what people actually do mm-hmm. and what people actually believe. And, as I say, that vocabulary of how you talk about beliefs, practices, and so on. If you bring that to the study of religion, for a start, what you're doing is saying, no, this isn't about what people are supposed to believe or are supposed to do. It's about what people actually believe and what people actually do. And constantly how they negotiate, perhaps, between a formal, institutionalized religious tradition and how they make that work in everyday life. We have wonderful examples throughout the centuries of that, what seems to some people an illogical, unexpected marriage of certain beliefs and practices. Good example being the Reverend Kirk, the Presbyterian minister who wrote the wonderful book, The Secret Commonwealth, mm-hmm. to describe the fairy kingdom, so that you would know who and what you were dealing with. Yeah. So for him, there isn't a problem that you can be a good Presbyterian Christian, but you might have to know how to deal with the fairy folk.
Or James VI's, Malleus Maleficarum, is that the right pronunciation? You defined folklore there as cultural tradition. It occurs to me that some scholars, including your associate Graham Harvey, would want to describe religion as cultural tradition. I know, for instance, he avoids using the term belief as much as humanly possible. So, in that, from that point of view, then, folklore really is just a way of describing an aspect of religion or a view of religion, isn't it?
No, I think cultural tradition is that broad canvas of how people do everyday life. Mm-hmm. And therefore, the cultural tradition, or what is normal to you, it's that interaction with religious or spiritual ideas. Sorry, I don't think I think I lost track of the question of the sentence halfway through. Let me think of this.
No problem.
Cultural tradition, I would say, isn't just about belief in a religious or spiritually informed way, because cultural tradition covers far more, from fashion to food to whatever.
Okay, yeah.
So it's that's the stuff of life, if you like. So I would use cultural tradition in a much broader sense. And then, of course, you might ask tricky questions about culture. But again, I'm using, just as we would say, well, who are the folk? Well, it's a group of people with something in common, whether that's age, gender, occupation, locality. That culture, especially nowadays, is very much where you are getting your reference from, as it were.
But to quote yourself,
No.
isn't it a very common but modern Western conception that religion is an added extra, something which is somehow divorced from real life? So from that point of view, religion is all of that stuff of life, isn't it?
Oh, it is, absolutely, because, yes, sorry, I think I was misconstruing your question. Yes, okay, so religion and cultural tradition, as far as I'm concerned, have to go hand in hand, because how you do life is going to be affected by what you believe in terms of how you think the world is. So whether you think the world is a one-shot chance at one life in what is God's creation, or whether you think this world is one of a series of worlds in which you will learn, pass through, go on to another world, etc., etc., whether you think this world is something in which most people act incorrectly, and you know how they should really be acting, and so on. So it can't help but that your worldview cannot help but infuse everything you do. So yes, to that extent, to the extent that I see religion and cultural tradition being enmeshed, and why I don't think you can separate religion from everyday life, it's that deep-seated belief on my part, if you like, that people don't really have neat compartments, that we constantly blend and merge, and that actually, although it's messy, we are very happy with fuzzy boundaries and fluidity in the way we do life. And therefore, what has happened perhaps sometimes with the study of religion is to try and essentialise it, take it out and say, lifting one part of human activity, say, oh, that's religion. Yeah. And if it's not religious, it's secular. Or to say, oh, look, that's sacred, and if it's not sacred, it's profane. Yeah. But for most people doing things, they may have an idea that some things are more special, some places are more special, or whatever, but it's not quite this neat scheme of things that perhaps we tend to impose in scholarship.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about vernacular religion with you, because it seems very clear to me that, or this is how what I think anyway, is that this is the real stuff of religion here. As you said, religion as it's lived every day and expressed in the practices of people. This idea of beliefs and it being this realm outside of our lives, I think it's imposed on scholarship because of our Protestant bias, I think, and I think that there are enormous implications for the way we conceptualise religion by going down this avenue. I was wondering whether you have read Martin Stringer's contemporary ethnography and the definition of religion, because I think he's going down a very similar line when he's talking about situational belief.
That's right. And to some extent, I think that's a good example that situational belief, I guess, is the sort of feel that we're trying to get with vernacular religion, because it's about where you are and what you have to hand by way of your building materials, as it were.
Exactly. So let's let's ask you to talk a little bit about Glastonbury then. I know that you've done a lot of fieldwork in Glastonbury, and as an example of vernacular religion. Maybe you could take one, say a ritual or something from Glastonbury, and demonstrate how it's a sort of a localised vernacular tradition.
Okay. I've probably spent a ridiculous amount of time in Glastonbury over the last 10 to 15 years, but it is endlessly fascinating on all sorts of levels, because there you have what are considered to be, if you like, traditional forms of religiosity, alongside what are very obviously new, emergent, developing, flexible forms of belief and practice, some of which looks like people think religion should look, and some of which just doesn't.
Yeah.
So it's a wee bit like, as someone said, having a spiritual laboratory, because you can see trends emerge and change. You can see the way that different religious groups do learn from and interact with each other. So it's a very reactive place. And you can see occasionally, you feel as if something's shifted in terms of a more general understanding on the part of both scholars and the people who are actually living, working, doing their thing in Glastonbury. But I think the thing that gets overlooked in Glastonbury is this, if you like, vernacular aspect of Christianity.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that actually. Yeah.
Because Christianity in Glastonbury has a whole baggage, if you like, of beliefs and myths that aren't, crudely put, mainstream Christian, but that are very important to, among others, practicing Christians in Glastonbury. So the idea that Christianity came directly to Glastonbury, brought over by Joseph of Arimathea, has been picked up by all sorts of people. The idea that Glastonbury is the cradle of English Christianity, that at Glastonbury you had the site of the first Christian church in England, is very, very powerful to a lot of people. Now, can we prove it? Of course we can't. Is it important? You bet. And on top of that, then, the idea, through this lovely, lovely instance of Bible of the Folk, which is very much about people filling in the silences in the Bible, you know, all these things that inexplicably aren't written down, so people just fill in the gaps. So if Joseph of Arimathea did bring Christianity to Glastonbury, might he not at some point have brought Jesus to might Joseph of Arimathea, might not he have, I'm sorry, I keep getting my double negatives there. Might Joseph of Arimathea have brought Jesus to Glastonbury? And this idea of Jesus in Glastonbury is a phenomenally influential idea. This means that you have Christians of different denominations perhaps coming on pilgrimage to Glastonbury and really, truly feeling that they are walking in the footsteps of Christ, for example. You have people from different Christian denominations kind of competing for the heart and soul of Glastonbury because it is thought to be so significant. You had, from the time of the Reformation onwards, you had people pointing to Glastonbury as pristine, pure Christianity, as someone told me, before Roman Christianity was imposed on us. So these debates, these ideas, these whole trains of thought that are set off by what is essentially a myth, but a vernacular Christian myth, very pertinent to Glastonbury, these are still active and they're important. So this gives us, there are various things here. Let me unpack this bit by bit. So, for example, in Glastonbury, you do indeed have what's referred to as the Holy Thorn, or Glastonbury thorn, which traditionally flowers both in spring, as you'd expect, but also around Christmas. And So, of course, stories, you have something strange, you explain it, right? You make up a story. You develop a story. So, of course, the idea, probably the most common explanation of this is that it grew from the staff that Joseph of Arimathea planted on Weariall Hill when he and his companions arrived. And this idea, of course, of a staff, a stick that takes root and flowers is a very recurring motif in folklore, in stories. It could be that. Some people, it has been said that it was grown from the thorn from the crown of thorns.
Okay.
A lesser-known variant, but it's there. So you've got something strange, you explain it. In the Glastonbury context, because for some people you have the given of the connection of Joseph of Arimathea, certainly, with Glastonbury, that tree takes on a life of its own. And so all the examples of the Holy Thorn around Glastonbury are linked into that story. If you know that story, you can't see a Glastonbury thorn without thinking of that connection. So then we have the Holy Thorn ceremony, which happens in the run-up to Christmas annually, and a sprig from the tree in the grounds of St. John's Church is clipped and sent to the royal family. In a ceremony that we know originated in its present form in the late 1920s, but which every time you speak to someone gets older and older and older. Because, again, it is the nature of custom, particularly calendar custom, that people just keep aging it. Because it's there, people keep reading back.
It only has to be one generation back for that generation to view it as always having
time
happened.
Immemorial. Anything older than your grandfather is time immemorial.
Yeah,
you know?
pretty much.
And so that's a very good example of the way that, stories, customs, beliefs, they dig down. They go deeper and deeper and deeper. So, actually, the Holy Thorn ceremony is quite a Glastonbury ceremony. But what does it do? Each year, it gets the school kids in Glastonbury into the church grounds, hearing the story of Joseph of Arimathea again, and reinforcing that connection of Joseph of Arimathea, the Thorn, and Glastonbury, constantly reinforcing for a Christian context the importance of Glastonbury. So, already in Christianity, the institutionalised form of religion that's often in the past would have been thought of as official religion or whatever, is undermined by the fact that it's dealing with something that isn't official at all, but it's a strongly held belief.
One of the things I find very fascinating about the Holy Thorn ceremony in particular, and vernacular religion in general, is the way that you get these bricolages of. So in the case of the Holy Thorn, you've got what you called the Bible of the folk. So these folk extrapolations of fairly cryptic and basic stories in the Bible. You've then got a layer which is this tree veneration and season veneration, which is drawn from what we might call Celtic, and I'm doing the scare quotes in the air as I say that for our listeners. And then a third layer of absolutely locally specific practices and beliefs. I find that absolutely fascinating. What I would like to ask you, though, is this has always been the case, though, hasn't it? This isn't because when we talk about Glastonbury, we maybe tend to think about New Age and these, diffuse, popular, reactive expressions of spirituality. Listening to you talking there, I think this has always been the way, hasn't it? This is what it's always been like, and the elite impositions of what we should be believing, which we've been paying our most attention to, were the least of it, really.
Exactly. I think a lot of what's happening now in the public face, if you like, of myth and ritual and belief, and indeed in our study of these phenomena, is simply that things that have been happening all along are more public, are more owned on the part of people doing them, and are at last being more noticed by academics. Because for too long we accepted the line that a particular institutionalised form of religion was it. And of course that's nonsense. Because most, in my terms, most religious activity occurs outside a formal religious context. And also the idea that you have a person who is professionally religious. They don't do things. They don't have a mixture of beliefs. They don't have an interesting assortment of mental furniture. That's rubbish. So you're right. A lot of what we are seeing as contemporary spirituality is actually what I think I and people like Leonard Primiano would describe as vernacular religion. It's what people do. That idea that, this mix and match culture that's sometimes talked about most dismissively, as if people haven't always quite satisfactorily for their own day-to-day lives combined different bits of belief and ritual and practice, as if perfectly loyal classic Presbyterian Scots haven't occasionally felt it was a good idea to be wearing silver or to be doing certain things, because why would you take chances? Do you know what I mean? So, but of course there have been times when to disagree with or to own up to anything other than supposed religious orthodoxy was inadvisable, if not downright dangerous. People haven't really articulated that. So I think what we've been seeing since the sort of latter part of the 20th century in particular is a glorious coming out, if you like, of what people do.
Yeah.
And just as we were saying, well, cultural tradition, it's what you put things together from, and we've talked about bricolage and this wonderful idea of putting things together. People have done that. But what has happened now is this huge mushrooming, if you like, of resources that people now feel quite happy to draw upon.
Yeah.
So beyond their, let's say, national or local cultural tradition, that has become part of the mix. And people are putting together things in what seems to them perfectly natural combinations.
Yeah. I mean, the way I've been thinking about it recently is, people like Helas and Woodhead have talked about the spiritual revolution, and I know that they've softened their position since then. But it seems to me that there's not so much a spiritual revolution as there's a radical detraditionalization where people are realizing that they can do whatever they want and be honest about it. And what's happened is that simply we as scholars have woken up to it.
Yeah.
And it's probably always been the case.
I think that's one area in which religious studies has a lot to learn from our European colleagues in particular. The folklorists and ethnographers have been working away on the nitty-gritty of daily life. So looking at nominally Catholic cultures, let's say in Hungary, but actually paying attention to what people were using holy water for.
Yeah.
Or paying attention to the fact that people would have religious pictures on their wall, but more to the point, they would be carrying out conversations with the figure in that picture, because they had a personal relationship with them. It wasn't devotional in the sense of them being distant. The point was, the saint you had by your bedside or whatever, you were sharing your day with him or her. And that detailed ethnography that some of our European colleagues have been involved in most conscientiously and for a long time, contemporary scholars of religion have a lot to learn from them, and I think you are seeing more of a flow of information and ideas and practices between them now. What people perhaps think about Glastonbury is that it's this place where it's New Age, pagan, new forms of religiosity. That's all true. But what often gets left out of that equation is the fact that many of the people who are following spiritual paths, developing spiritual paths there, are actually united in a mission because they all agree that Glastonbury is special and sacred in some way. So what I have seen a very definite development over recent years in Glastonbury, that although there are a number of people very self-consciously on different, as they would say, spiritual paths, they've actually felt that it is non-threatening and non-compromising to come together to work for the good of Glastonbury. And there's now much more of a sense that they can unite around this one thing, which is feeling that they have a duty to Glastonbury, to bring people to Glastonbury so that they can experience that for themselves and make of it what they will. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really interesting development and something new. The other thing which I think I sort of started to say is a lot of what in the past will have been regarded as alternative spirituality, you have to say, alternative to what? A lot of so-called alternative spirituality in Glastonbury builds on those vernacular Christian myths. Yeah. So the Druids who think, well, of course Jesus came to Glastonbury because there was a huge Druidic centre of learning in Glastonbury. Yeah. Of course, some of the healers would say, of course Jesus came to Glastonbury. He got healing energy from Glastonbury. So again, people weave, interweave, use, recreate, reformulate existing materials as well as adding their own insights or as well as adding things from other cultural sources. But I would get back to the point. Glastonbury isn't typical, of course it's not, but it's indicative of a whole load of trends elsewhere. Yeah. And so, as I've been saying for ages, the trick, as far as I'm concerned, is not to try and define alternative. The trick nowadays is to try and define mainstream.
Now that's a perfect place to draw a close. So lots to think about there. Thanks very much, Dr. Bowman.
Thank you.
You've just been listening to David speaking with Marion Bowman of the Open University on the topic of vernacular religion. That interview was recorded at the Sacred Practices of Everyday Life conference organised by the Religion and Society programme hosted at the University of Edinburgh back at the start of May. We're taking you back a few months next week when David again will be speaking with David Vos of the University of Exeter, who's going to be talking about the broad topic of quantitative approaches to the study of religion. Now, we've had a few interviews. We've had Ariella Kazar, who was presenting a sort of demographer's approach, and we've had Callum Brown on historical approaches, but using historical stats and census data and things like that. David Vos is a very eminent researcher in the social scientific study of religion, using large-scale data sets, and he just takes David right through the basics of how you go about doing quantitative research. And David maybe gives him a bit of a hard time, because we've had a few discussions lately about this. So we're delighted to have David Vos talking about that, and he does a brilliant job of presenting quantitative research and a sort of rigorous defence of that. As ever, you can download this from our website or through iTunes. You can find out more about us by following us on Facebook or on Twitter, keeping up with the sort of discussion that goes on there, the more unofficial side of the project. And we hope you download again next week, and thanks very much for listening.